Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette 141. Looks like we're up and broadcasting yet again, where we read philosophy papers and review them live on air. So let's see what's new this week. I have some stuff I saved from last week that I didn't get to up here, so maybe I'll look at those if there's nothing particularly bioethics journal. Take a look real quick. A lot of times that's a little too sciencey, but hey, why not? Oh, look at all this bioethics. Okay, so this is getting back to where we were just a few days ago. Yeah. Okay. Comparative cinema. Oh, I have not seen that. Yeah, I get the usual suspects on the, Oh. Wait. Comparative cinema. Oh, it's a review, alright. You know, that was like, whoa, comparative cinema, not seeing that journal here. The front page of Phil Papers is swamped usually with the journals that publish a lot, so you don't always get a variety on that anymore. I've come to realize that. Alright, so the problem with this stuff is it's a little sciencey, and reading science stuff is hard because you're, and sometimes it's really too short. So we've got like 2-page essays here, another 2-page essay here. This is a 12-page. I suspect it's going to be double column, so that's more like 24-page. So it's a little hard to judge. The case against solicitation of consent for apnea testing. I mean, let's just go take a look real briefly. Yeah, see, these are all the ones that are short, but this is unusually short. Like a 2-page essay is little unusual for philosophy, at least. And yeah, so it's like 4 pages, but I don't have access, so it doesn't matter. Well, maybe I have access. Let's find out. No. Alright, so this is why I don't do this journals, because I just well, maybe I'll figure it out one day. I just haven't figured it out yet. Alright, so that's not going to work. Let's go to the journal list and see if I can find something here. Let's see what's most popular. And we can also look at see what's on the front page of Phil Archive, because that updates, but at a different rate than other things. But these are guaranteed to be here, of course. I think this is on Taggart's Theory of Time. Did I read that already? I don't know. So that looks like that's Descartes and Circular Inertia, 1999. See, it's interesting because you get things that were uploaded much later than I mean, a lot of times the other stuff is new. These are can be much older. I mean, so that paper from 2005. The number of bricks in a cigarette. And it's like Mathematics magazine. No idea. Okay, so let's look at the journal list briefly, and maybe what we'll do is go back to this one. If let's just go take a look at this one right now, for that matter. Oh, it's 13 pages, but small font. That's right. Let's take a look at it real briefly, because I'll just do this. I haven't done some politics in a day or two, probably. And, okay, this is fine. Let's just do this one from Constellations, because I had this, and if nothing else is easily available, this is why should I complain when I have stuff ready to go. So if you come into chat and you want to follow along, you can type the command !paper in the chat box, and the link will come back up. Otherwise, if you're watching this later, the link will be below the video in the show notes. So here we go. Yep, and feel free to ask questions, chat, as we go. This is my first time reading it along with you. So I will do my best to explain what's going on if it makes enough, if I think I understand anything going on. I mean, these people tend to make sense, at least somewhat, so sometimes it's harder than others, but whatever. Here we go. Introduction. What is neoliberalism? Who knows? Who knows? In his canonical study, David Harvey introduces neoliberalism as a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free market, and free trade. However, he also adds, with a quote from Paul Trenner, that the neoliberal belief in the market constitutes an ethic in itself, capable of acting as a guide to all human action and substituting for all previously held ethical beliefs. It's a little scary all of a sudden that the market somehow constitutes all of ethics, and that neoliberalism has pervasive effects on ways of thought to the point where it has become incorporated into the common sense way many of us interpret, live in, and understand the world. I don't doubt that. The question of neoliberalism, then, is just as much about ethics, forms of life, everyday hermeneutics, and philosophical anthropology as it is about political economy. Despite this initial emphasis on the centrality of the entrepreneurial ethos and its totalitizing tendencies, however, Harvey's study offers little insight into how those pervasive effects come about and how they stabilize and promote the neoliberal project. Rather, it conceptualizes neoliberalism as just another ideological tool of the capitalist ruling class, which, after being hit by the stagflation crisis in the 70s, started an orchestrated program of accumulation through dispossession to restore the power of economic elites. Despite his perceptive insight into some of neoliberalism's novelty, Harvey ultimately reduces its role in the capitalist-driven class struggle of a society that is understood in orthodox Marxist categories. Okay. But if the neoliberal effects on ethics and common sense are in fact so pervasive and all-encompassing, it is those very categories that are at stake. It is here that Foucauldian approaches, preoccupied with the coevolution of modern state and subjectivity, can play out their advantages. Their main conceptual tool to shed light on the nexus of the state and the subject is Foucault's notion of governmentality, an ugly word. Well, sure it is, but all philosophy is full of ugly words, so you don't get to make fun of it. So, that he introduced in 1978 to overcome some of the theoretical problems of traditional Marxism. You know, I've said this before, and it was a quote from Graham Harman, a continental philosopher, but he said, look, pretension is a job hazard in philosophy. You're going to do things that are pretentious, like coining new words and ugly words. Just bite the bullet and get over it. Don't apologize. Just be like, okay, look, just say it is and then move on. It's not helpful to call your own work ugly. It's in some sense necessary to do those sort of semi-pretentious things. It is rhetorically useful to get people's attention to certain concepts via pretension in some sense. It's a pragmatic thing. Okay, so government for Foucault denotes all kinds of strategies that structure the field of possible action, and the governmentality approach consists in examining how forms of rationality inscribe themselves in practices or systems of practice and what role they play within them, because it is true that practices do not exist without a certain regime of rationality. This conceptual tool allows Foucault to explain what Harvey merely observes. Neoliberalism is not just, as it is for Harvey, always the same thing, that is capitalism but worse. Instead, neoliberalism can be analyzed as a new regime of rationality or governmentality. This new rationality affects not only the repertoire of government's potential actions, deregulation, privatization, the creation of artificial market environments, etc., but also shapes the individual's conduct, that is, the way individuals govern themselves and others. In the words of Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval, in advancing Foucault's analysis, at stake in neoliberalism is nothing more nor less than the form of existence, the way in which we are led to conduct ourselves, to relate to others and to ourselves. Neoliberalism can be defined as the set of discourses, practices, and apparatuses that determine a new mode of government of human beings in accordance with the universal principle of competition. Yeah, I mean, this is I don't do much social philosophy or political philosophy, but you get to see the people in the United States fighting with each other over whether or not to stay in quarantine or even just to wear a, like, 10-cent mask. They don't like this form of control because for some reason it freaks them out. Yeah, but it's this universal principle. They don't like that little thing in their face, and they get very, their 10-cent mask is very important to them. Anywho, traces of this universal principle of competition can be found far beyond the economic sphere and the workfare policies of contemporary social and educational systems. It has become an influential cultural narrative too, ranging from happiness guidebooks to, say, the quantified self movement. The neoliberal rationality thus promotes and enforces a bundle of regulative ideas on how to exist, behave, and flourish as a human being. As a vast body of literature, this is what I was just saying, that the regulative ideas on how to exist, the fact that you have to wear a mask all of a sudden is impinging on this, and it's like people are freaking out because their rationality is broken now, that their understanding of what to do is broken. Okay. As a vast body of literature has shown, the subjectivity thereby created is distinctively entrepreneurial. It is for the entrepreneur who figures as the hero of the neoliberal narrative of universal competition. Ulrich Brocklund's genealogy of neoliberal subjectivity, for example, traces the emergence of the entrepreneurial self from the 1980s onwards as a real fiction similar to the doctrine of Homo economicus that became hegemonic less than a century earlier, and which remains the backbone of the new paradigm. In contrast to the classical economic man of Bentham or Smith, as Wendy Brown reminds us, the neoliberal subject is an intensely constructed and governed bit of human capital, tasked with improving and leveraging its competitive position and with enhancing its monetary and non-monetary portfolio value. This amalgamation of subjectivity and entrepreneurship takes one fraction of potential human actions and motivations, those that are directed towards competitive market environments, and declares them to be universal. One implication of this amalgamation that has not received nearly enough attention is the implicit subscription of neoliberalism to the doctrine of self-ownership. Neoliberal subjects own themselves, even if this implication is rarely made explicit in neoliberal theory, or so I will argue in what is to come. If neoliberal rationality analyzes the subject as the vanishing point of the acquisition, reinvestment, and reassessment of some kinds of resources, assets, capital, then someone must own this human capital. In order to delineate the concept of self-ownership, I will discuss its origin in early modern Britain in some length. This discussion will help preparing the main argument in section 3, where I aim to show that self-ownership is an indispensable part of neoliberal rationality, even if it remains implicit in most neoliberal theory, and use that for an imminent critique of neoliberalism. The conclusion summarizes the argument and discusses a few implications, section 4. And I'm annoyed about this paragraph yet again. This is not this author's fault, but I'm like, why do we need an index on a short paper? But it seems like this is what everyone's doing, and the only reason I can think of is that it makes reviewing these papers easier, which in some sense is a very, very, very good reason for including it, because it's short and it doesn't really hurt anything, but it annoys me when I'm reviewing, because I'm reading a million papers, so I'm like, why do I care? But it's very interesting that this has become such a part of the academic writing. It's like, not to belabor the point, because read the last sentence. The conclusion summarizes the argument and discusses a few implications. Yes, that's why it's the conclusion. It's like, well, you wouldn't call it conclusion otherwise. It's like, so, anywho, nothing against this author, it seems to be the norm now. And probably for good reason, because you get your paper published by having that paragraph there, which is the goal of writing papers, so that they get published and get read. The origin of self-ownership. To shed some light on the notion of self-ownership, let us explore the context of its first emergence, the socio-political conflicts of the 17th century Britain. By that time, the centralization of both legislation and the tax system had progressively superseded the feudal order, resulting in the growing dependence of the ruling class on economic forms of exploitation, as opposed to feudal serfdom. This intensified the ongoing enclosure of common land and the suppression of traditional conceptions of property and use rights. The result was not just a rising concentration of landed property in the hands of the gentry, but also the creation of huge numbers of dispossessed people, a straightforward case of accumulation through dispossession. Yeah, when you kick people off the land, you have their stuff, and they're dispossessed and you accumulate. Due to the spread of large-scale tenant farms that replaced the previous forms of subsistence agriculture and installed competitive market mechanisms for both rent and products, the result was the gradual emergence of a new economic regime, agrarian capitalism. The leveler's intention. The absolutist aspirations of the Stuart kings during the first half of the 17th century now collided with the interests of the emerging class of landowners, which eroded the long-standing alliance between Crown and Parliament and fueled the English Civil War. Roughly three parties in conflict emerged: the absolutist royalists, the oligarchic republicans, that is, the landowners, and the radical democrats, like the levelers. It is in the rhetoric of the latter, not as it is often said in Locke's second treatise, that the notion of self-ownership was first popularized. Richard Overton's famous 1646 pamphlet, An Arrow Against All Tyrants, for example, opens as follows: To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-property, else he could not be himself. And of this no second may presume to deprive any of, without manifest violation, an affront to the very principles of nature and the rules of equity and justice between man and man. Mine and thine cannot be, except this be: God by nature has made him free. Now, that was a nice opening paragraph. We don't write like that anymore. I mean, for good reason, but it's a little bit more poetic, it sounded. Okay. The levelers thus conflated property and liberty to present as strong a case as possible for their emancipatory and democratic claims. The royalists and oligarchic republicans argued that political liberties are conditional on material wealth and land ownership. The levelers accepted this conflation of liberty and property, but replaced landed property, which a privileged few owned, with property in the person, which everyone owns. This enabled them to use the well-established language of property against their political rivals. Every man is an owner, so if ownership grants political and economic rights, then every man has those rights. In consequence, property discourse could no longer be used to trump political rights discourse. Their intervention was therefore really just a way to claim self-governance and democratic rights, and self-ownership denotes from its very beginning a social relation rather than a relation to oneself. Yeah, speaking of the good writing here, this paper flows a lot better than other papers, so kudos to the author, Niklas Angebauer. I apologize for how I say your name. Sometimes philosophy does not, and I blame you logicians, because you're translating from your logic back into English, and it gets very stilted. Okay, Lockean self-ownership. 3 decades later, and in changed political circumstances, John Locke took up the issue of self-ownership and develops it into a comprehensive doctrine. In the second treatise, written to strengthen the Whigs' ideological position during the Exclusion Crisis, he famously states that every man has a property in his own person. There is no body has any right to but himself. This dictum has been the starting point of virtually every discussion of self-ownership ever since, and is often said to provide the normative foundation upon which Locke's political philosophy is built. This is more than an oversimple reading. Quite simply, it is wrong. Locke's conception of self-ownership is not as axiomatic or freestanding as it might seem. It borrows both its normativity and its specific content from elsewhere. Normatively, Locke's self-ownership is grounded in God's ownership of the human species, as his worship argument is intended to show. Being God's creation, human beings are his property, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. If they were to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, they would deprive God of this pleasure and thus violate natural law. This argument achieves two things at once. First, it naturalizes private property by inscribing it into the very nature of the created world, treating God as the ultimate owner. Second, it endows every individual with a sphere of non-interference against each other, a sphere that Locke calls property in the person. Importantly, this property is not attributed to a pre-existing human being with moral rights other than its self-ownership, but constitutes that very being. As such, however, this sphere of non-interference is a purely negative result, and its implications are far from clear. What exactly does it mean, positively speaking, to be a self-owner? After all, a mere sphere of non-interference is perfectly compatible with the idea that nobody owns anyone whatsoever, perhaps because Kant famously argued selves are not the kind of entities that can be owned at all. What we see here is that, as Alan Ryan instructively puts it, the notion of self-ownership is parasitic on whatever conception of property the speaker has in mind. What then is the specific content of Lockean self-ownership? What, in other words, is Locke's conception of proprietorship? I think there are two aspects to the answer to this question. First, the theological commitments Locke needs to get the notion off the ground to begin with establishing more than just a sphere of negative liberty. If the whole world is always already owned by God, its use requires entitlement. God grants this entitlement by giving the world to his humankind in common and commanding them to populate and subdue it. As we are to last during his, not another one's pleasure, this is more than merely an entitlement to make productive use of our sphere of independence. It is a duty to do so. Property in the person is thus more than just a sphere of negative liberty. It imposes certain obligations, or with Foucault, a certain rationality, on the subject it creates. As God gave the world to humans for their benefit and the greatest convenience of life they were capable to draw from it, there is a duty to be industrious and to subdue the earth, that is, to improve it for the benefit of life. Second, as these examples indicate, Locke has a distinct conception of proprietorship in mind when he speaks about property, that it is landed property. Admittedly, this is a somewhat speculative claim, but is supported by rich textual and biographical evidence. Yeah, feel free to ask anything you want while I'm reading, so let me know. Landed property was Locke's primary example of property throughout the second treatise, for example, when discussing the proviso, the invention of money, and the labor theory of value. As Neil Wood claims, of the 27 sections of chapter 22 refer to agricultural property and its problems. 2. Land is part of the normative foundation of the acquisition of property, as Locke stressed repeatedly. God, by commanding to subdue, gave authority so far as to appropriate. Locke himself called it the most important form of property. In his day, he tells us, the chief matter of property was no longer the fruits of the earth and the beasts that subsist on it, but the earth itself, that which takes in and carries with it all the rest. In a later edition of Second Treatise, Locke adds the passage which makes the improvement of land the very aim of politics. The increase of lands, the right employing of them, is a great art of government. 4. Locke was a deeply agrarian thinker. He was profoundly preoccupied with agricultural improvement and closure throughout both his personal and his professional life. Growing up in a rural area, he inherited a modest piece of his father. He inherited a modest piece of property at his father's death and dealt with farming activities after joining the household of the future Earl of Shaftesbury. He wrote extensively on agriculture, on agricultural economics, and in defense of colonialism and agrarian enclosure. He was in contact with many agrarian reformists and owned a multitude of handbooks and treatises on farming and agriculture. In Mexican's Woods summary, Locke was keenly interested in agriculture, and this interest is reflected in his theory of property. Traces of this model and its agricultural connotations can be found in Locke's account of property in the person too, most notably in its metaphorical language. Locke repeatedly uses phrases like invading others' rights, alluding to fences when talking about individuals' freedoms, or security from absolutist despotism and construed as positive laws, as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society. So we got like invasions and fences here. So when Locke thought of liberty as a sphere of non-interference, he was influenced by the model of an enclosed piece of land. And why wouldn't he? The model of landed property is attractive for Locke's purposes, mainly because of its intuitive association with liberty and the sense of identity it provides. Owning agrarian property, especially in Locke's times, makes people independent of one another and provides existential security, as it allows for self-sustenance and long-term investments into future revenues. Land ownership is also tied to a sense of identity, as it is relatively easy to fence off, that is, to establish boundary between what is one's own and the outside world. Similarly, if I own myself in the same way that I own a piece of land, I can fence off and cultivate what is valuable to me, such as my religious, civic, and economic virtues, without depending on others. It is this sphere that civil society aims to secure, for without a liberal state it would remain constantly exposed to the invasion of others. Yeah. And this is what freaks people out when you go, like, people really, I mean, they take this to heart. They freak out if you're on their property. This is I'm always in reference to U.S. News and politics, but, I mean, people get killed for dumb reasons just being on someone's property. To conclude our brief historical discussion, the notion of self-ownership was originally a rhetorical means used by the levelers to present as strong a case as possible against the association of material wealth and political rights. It accepted the oligarchic conflation of liberty and property, but metaphorically internalized the relevant property into the subject, thereby transforming the oligarchic argument into an egalitarian one. Locke took up these issues and developed them into a coherent doctrine. This doctrine, however, isn't easily reconcilable with the levelers' aims. Locke's brilliance is found in his ability to employ leveler discourse in ways that maintain rather than overturn the established hierarchies of power and the existing distribution of landed property. Besides launching a powerful attack on absolutism, and thereby channeling the more radical democratic forces during the exclusion crisis, Locke's argument served the interests of the landed class as well. They justified enclosure on colonial trade, they opened up the possibility of disenfranchising individuals through the notion of tacit consent, they analyzed social problems such as unemployment, a notorious by-effect of enclosure, as a mere failure of individual morality that called for harsh disciplinary means, ranging, in Locke's case, from forced labor and workhouses to cutting off ears. Ooh. Locke's political position in the two treatises is thus closer to that of Cromwell and Ireton to the levelers' oligarchic Republican opponents in the Putney debates. He witnessed the gradual rise of a new property regime that we later came to call agrarian capitalism, a regime that, don't know this word, deracinated and dispossessed unprecedented numbers of people by dissolving their commons-based and self-sustaining forms of life, but also set into motion tremendous productive forces. In this dynamic situation, Locke used the political fiction of self-ownership, as Carol Pateman calls it, to maintain that the only property that truly matters for individual liberty, property in the person, remained untouched. What was lost during enclosure is metaphorically compensated by discovery of property in the person. The credo, everyone an owner, took the sting out of the ongoing dispossessions and subjected everyone to an ethos or rationality of labor. Well, that's kind of damning, isn't it? It's like, oh, it's okay that you own nothing and you can't feed yourself because you own your own body. Yay. It's getting dark in here. Wow. Hold on one sec. Let me turn the light up. Actually, you can see me well enough. It's just the glow of the monitor. But I mean, it's almost 11 a.m. here, and it's a little rainy. So usually I just don't turn the light on because it gets hot. But wow, it's dark. Okay. Neoliberal self-ownership. To my knowledge, no prominent author from the neoliberal spectrum explicitly advocates the doctrine of self-ownership, and yet I want to argue that self-ownership remains a backbone of neoliberalism. My argument to that end proceeds in two steps. Earlier on, I introduced neoliberalism less as a theory of political and economic practices. Harvey? What's Harvey? Okay. Then a regime... Okay. So that's who introduced the theory. Then as a regime of rationality. So yeah, less as economic and more as rationality. Now I will argue first that all versions of neoliberal theory construe freedom essentially as economic freedom with a strong emphasis on property rights. Neoliberal freedom is a function of property. But being free qua ownership is not necessarily the same as being free qua self-ownership, although it is compatible with it. My second step will be to argue that in neoliberal rationality, we can find distinct traces of self-ownership. The entrepreneurial self is necessarily self-owning. Neoliberal theory, freedom as property. On the face of it, liberty or freedom seems like the ultimate normative foundation of neoliberal theory. However, neoliberals unequivocally spell out freedom as a function of economic freedom, that is, freedom of contract, the inviolability of property, and the duty to compensate another for damage due to his fault. For neoliberals, strong private property rights are thus necessary conditions of freedom. This is a first point of convergence of all major variants of neoliberalism. Whether we consult ordoliberalism, with its emphasis on the ordered freedom of competitive entrepreneurs who pursue their interests in a market society ordered by a strong state, or Austrian school liberalism, where political freedom is conceived as nothing but the corollary of economic freedom, and property rights are seen as the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not. Or Chicago school liberalism, where it is claimed that economic freedom is the necessary condition for political and civil freedom, and that property rights are the most basic of human rights and an essential foundation for other human rights. The rhetoric always remains the same: freedom is grounded in the inviolability of private property. Contrary to Locke or classical liberalism, however, neoliberals see property less as a natural right than as a right that has to be naturalized wherever it enhances the efficiency of market society. This shift is a second point at which neoliberal theory converges, even if the various approaches spell it out in different ways. For example, Hayek's cultural evolutionism explicitly echoes Locke's theory of property, but secularizes it by replacing God with competitive evolutionary mechanisms understood in market terms. Other authors are more straightforwardly constructivist or positivistic, but what they all share is the idea that the choice of an institutional framework of market society, property rights among others, is subject to the same rationale as choices within the market. Here we can see Dardot and Laval's universal principle of competition at work, see above. While Locke introduces, well, this is interesting, page 2, did they actually, yeah, see, there's not section 2, page 2. You don't normally see people do that because the page 2 here does not reference the page 2. It's the second page of this essay, not the second page of the journal. So it's the first time I've seen that misreference or mis-cross-reference within a paper. Within the market. It should have been section 2 probably. While Locke introduces God as the ultimate owner to naturalize private property, is now the market's rationality that figures as the ultimate court of appeal. If society is but a competitive market, strong property rights are the only means to realize personal freedom, as they enable everyone to participate in that market. The reconceptualization of these rights in entrepreneurial terms is a third point at which neoliberal theory converges. The shift from everyone an owner to everyone an entrepreneur does not come at all at once. It emerges gradually. It is present in the ordoliberal dream of the peasant core of society, an agricultural utopia with small-scale landowners or entrepreneurs that aim to avert the threat of proletarianization by fragmenting and pacifying the working class. In the Austrian school, the new paradigm is developed more systematically. Mises reconceptualizes the economy from the perspective of its participants and ends up arguing that in any real and living economy, every actor is always an entrepreneur. Kerzner, in his pupil, explains that anyone is a potential entrepreneur, as the purely entrepreneurial role presupposes no special initial good fortune in the form of valuable assets, but only a specific mindset. Chicago School neoliberalism takes up this approach and develops it into a comprehensive theory, human capital theory. This seals the equation of human agency or freedom and the economic activity of firms in competitive market environments, which forms the heart of what was to become the rationality of the neoliberal subject. Okay, so this is the conversion, I guess, of the sort of freedom into this economic rationality and how you square that. Okay, so here we are, neoliberal rationality. Capital in the person. So instead of it being rationality in the person, it's the capital that gives you the rationality, and that's in the person. Okay. So, you can't have, if you have no money, I mean, there's plenty of studies nowadays showing that if you have no money, you can't think, you become less rational, and in some sense, this sort of article makes you worry that our understanding of rationality itself is tainted, or not necessarily tainted, but has built into it economics into it. And so maybe we don't really understand rationality, but in that sense, these studies that say when you are under stress and you have no money, which is very, very stressful and bad for your thinking, that may actually be, we are looking at that wrong. We have to think of new ways of thinking about rationality to account for that, and not just consider it as a mistake of rationality. So that'd be an interesting thing to look at. I mean, still, if you're just stressed, you can't think. That's true too. But if this sort of argument holds through, then we might have to go back and reassess how we actually understand stress and rationality. Okay. Neoliberal rationality is an offspring of neoliberal theory, but it is not identical to it. The political and cultural implementation of neoliberal theory is not just its application to practice, but rather sends it through a number of filters, such as political and economic feasibility, socio-cultural circumstances, hegemony, or the availability of disciplinary apparatuses. Rather than being uniform and continuous, it is a dynamic, heterogeneous, and localized process that gradually brings about neoliberalism's pervasive effects by establishing a new conduct of conduct, or a new governmental rationality. Wherever this rationality intersects with human agency or subjectivity, it promotes and enforces a new type of subject. The entrepreneur of himself, being for himself, is his own capital. Importantly, this entrepreneurial orientation is not a dimension of the neoliberal subject, but its very core. Seen from neoliberal rationality, we are not entrepreneurs and family members, friends, lovers, or citizens, but in those very roles we are entrepreneurs, constantly trying to invest our time and abilities in the most profitable ways. This is, as Foucault reminds us, precisely the argument from human capital theory as developed by Theodor Schultz and Gary Becker. Capital is everything that produces income. The human being, with its bodily and mental capacities, produces income. Therefore, it must be a form of capital. As bodily and mental capacities are essential features of humans, human beings are essentially capital, that is, human capital. My argument is that this entrepreneurial subject running its own existence like a firm through the acquisition, investment, and reassessment of human capital is essentially an owner. Human capital, if this notion is to make sense at all, cannot be left unowned. It is no coincidence that the neoliberal self is not managerial but entrepreneurial. While a manager runs an enterprise without owning it, the entrepreneur is by definition its owner or partial owner. A manager's bonus payment might be at stake if she does a bad job, but not so her own capital. Do I have anything to say about this? I was just thinking, like, maybe this is why we have such a hate for, like, middle managers, like, it's a cultural thing, like, to hate on, like, middle managers, when, of course, many middle managers are, like, excellent, great people, but it's like, there's some sort of a cultural thing that, like, hates on middle manager, like, they're not managerial, like, you should have been an entrepreneur, not a manager, so, yeah. Just wonder if that kind of is behind that sort of drive and that sort of societal or cultural opinion. This implication is rarely discussed explicitly. If it is often driven by conflation of neoliberalism and libertarianism. One of the few exceptions is anthropologist Ilana Gershon, who note the move from the liberal vision of people owning themselves as though they were property to a neoliberal vision of people owning themselves as though they were a business. This kind of argument, however, has not remained unchallenged. Michael Fair, for example, holds that the relationship of neoliberal subject to his or her human capital cannot be properly defined as ownership. Fair's argument is that neoliberal subjects cannot sell their human capital, they cannot be said to own it, properly speaking. Rather than a possessive relationship, it is that of the free laborer with his labor or her labor power. The relationship between the liberal subject and his or her human capital should be called speculative in every sense of the word. Fair clearly has a point. There's an important difference between liberal and neoliberal subjects. The question is, however, whether this difference is best cast along the divide of ownership or speculation. I think, unsurprising, that Fair is too quick to dismiss the notion of self-ownership. His argument fails for two reasons. First, on a conceptual level, it assumes that property necessarily implies the right to sell. But while there is an institutive association between property and alienability, the latter is not one of the defining features of property. The term inalienable property is not a contradiction in terms. But if it isn't, then human capital might be inalienable and still count as property. Indeed, human capital is sometimes treated as a form of unalienable property, for example, in U.S. divorce and bankruptcy law. There is some interesting stuff. People have been, for investment, they dedicate future work of theirs. Like, if you pay for my school, I'll go work for you for a few years or something. So it's like, what exactly is being sold there? Secondly, Fair overstates the difference between labor power and human capital with respect to their alienability. If we think of human capital inalienable is probably because we cannot separate it from its owner. However, strictly speaking, labor power is not separable from its owner either, as it cannot be disentangled from their mental and physical presence at the workplace, as Carol Pateman has famously argued. Nevertheless, we can contract it out, as every work contract witnesses, even if the separability of owner and owned is but a political fiction, as a constant as if. But if laborers can nevertheless be said to own their labor power, a claim Fair accepts, then it is not clearly why the entrepreneurial self shouldn't be considered the owner of its capitals too. Just like the liberal subject, it could contract out its human capitals as if it were separable for them. In fact, this is precisely what has recently become possible. In so-called human capital contracts, this is what I was trying to bring up earlier. One can trade shares of one's human capital, fictive as they might be to real-world investors. One of the proponents of this idea dreams of a global market where the human capital can be traded, either directly or through derivative securities, enabling capital to flow wherever there is an opportunity to liberate value by investing in education. Probably the most important form of HCCs are income share agreements. Discussing them more carefully will be helpful to tease out some implications of neoliberal rationality and to assessing them critically. Governing by debt, income share agreements. In the USA, student loans are the second biggest source of household debt, ranging from $1.5 trillion and rising steadily. Recently, ISAs have become proposed as an alternative to traditional student loans. A number of institutions and online-based startups have implemented ISAs, and the question of ISA's future keeps stirring public attention across political divides. The guiding idea behind ISAs date back to a 1955 book by Milton Friedman for the history of ISAs, C. Schwartz. Friedman argues that while basic education up until college benefits all and should therefore be financed by the state, professional education is a private investment whose primary beneficiary is oneself. Therefore, it should be financed privately, that is, if necessary, by raising the wind at market conditions. In the absence of suitable collaterals for loan, Friedman proposed that borrowers allow investors to buy a share of an individual's earning prospects to advance him the funds needed to finance his training on conditions that he agree to pay a lender a specific fraction of his future earnings. In other words, Friedman proposes the use of human capital as collateral in exchange for higher education funding. While Friedman applies his idea only to professional education, it is not limited to this field and has been put to use in other contexts, too, for example, in professional sports. In recent years, a number of startups have started to put Friedman's idea into practice. One of them is Pave.com, essentially a crowdfunding website for human beings. So, are you just buying people again? Like, is that really what we're doing? I thought we tried to get rid of that, although it's a little naive to say we got rid of it. I mean, we've been trying to get rid of this for a while, haven't we? Now we're just bringing it back again. The website brings together backers, financial institutions, wealthy individuals, and talent, who offer shares of their future income in exchange for funding, using algorithms that predict their future income based on a thorough assessment of their finance. Oh man, this is just like right here. Oopsie. Algorithm, no. This right here. Algorithms that predict their future income. I mean, how much you want to bet that if you're white, you're going to get a future prediction than if you're black in America? I mean, it just seems like this is like the most... Like, this is going to be the most racist possible way to do things. Oh, God. Like, what are we up to again? Based on a thorough assessment of their financial and personal situation. Yeah, what counts as personal? Oh, man. The website sets a certain price for those shares, a price that includes a robust return on investment rate for the investors if all goes well. To attract backers, the talent are advised to use social media to share their progress, so you market yourself, literally transforming their social capital into a steady flow of cash, which is again invested in the self, into the self and its economic prospects. There could hardly be a more straightforward application of human capital theory or neoliberal rationality more generally. ISAs bring some of those implications of entrepreneurial subjectivization to the table that often remain implicit in neoliberal theory. Most importantly, for my argument, ISAs analyze human capital unequivocally as a form of property. One can use as collateral what one owns. Serving as a collateral for personal debt is one of the principal functions of private property. If ISAs are, as I have argued, an epitome of neoliberal rationality, it follows that neoliberal rationality does indeed treat human capital as a form of property, a property in the person. Now, using ISAs as an epitome of neoliberal rationality allows us not just to analyze the pervasiveness of this rationality, but also some of the perversions it brings about. According to its proponents, neoliberalism treats everyone as equals, makes them free and independent, and allows for ethical self-determination. In sharp contrast to these claims, the rationale as epitomized in ISAs reinforces inequality, makes people more dependent and their lives more precarious, and leads to self-censorship and ethical impoverishment. It reinforces social inequalities. In a world of racial and gender wage gaps and unequal economic prospects, white male human capital is quite simply of higher value and thus more attractive to investors, who besides tend to be from a very specific social milieu and have their own biases and prejudices. This stabilizes conditions of inequality while hiding it behind a rhetoric of merit and personal responsibility. Income predictions thus transform into self-fulfilling prophecies. It leads to precariousness by making people more dependent on outside conditions. As the value of human capital is not intrinsic but a positional good that is established only by market competition, it requires constant work on the self to be maintained, let alone enhanced, for one's competitors are never idle. But then, neoliberal rationality and entrepreneurial subjectivization do not provide existential security and independence from others, but make people more dependent on the market, requiring them to adapt constantly. Paradoxically, the precariousness of the borrowers feeds into the lender's stability. What's interesting about this nowadays is with the coronavirus, you can see just the complete breakdown of supply chains in the United States, and that's why it's not like there's not enough food or there's not enough products. It's just that the supply chains are so tightly there's no margin for error there. And so everything becomes very precarious, even though there's food and there's plenty of stuff to buy and sell. It's just not here right now because it's so precarious how we get the supply chain from there to there. And so this really seems like when it breaks down, this precariousness, it breaks down very badly because it looks like any severe jolt to the system, it makes it really dangerous. And so it would have massive effect on any person that had to constantly be in this sort of improvement supply chain, as it were. Okay. It leads to self-censorship and ethical impoverishment. The universal competition installs a regime of voluntary self-censorship that mutes alternative ways of being and acting. Joining a political protest, for example, or deviating from social norms in general becomes a risky enterprise when one's future income is under constant scrutiny. Spending one's formative years under the Damocles sword of losing the trust of one's investors shapes one's subjectivity in ways that are almost impossible to assess, especially at that point in life. Yeah, you got muzzled, economic muzzled. My argument is not, of course, that ISAs capture all the wrong with neoliberalism, nor even that they are a supremely important government technique of neoliberal rationality. All I claim is that ISAs condense some implications to the idea of entrepreneurial subjectivization that often remains implicit. If we accept with Foucault that in order to understand neoliberalism, we have to understand neoliberal rationality and subjectivity, furthermore, that neoliberal subjectivity is essentially entrepreneurial and is epitomized in human capital theory, and that commercial ISAs are a straightforward exemplification of human capital theory, then we can see that the neoliberal subject is construed as self-owning, even if this typically remains implicit. Because the remains implicit is because how bad that just sounded right above. This is why they don't actually want to claim it, because it does sound bad when you spell it out like that. However, we can also see that neoliberal subjectivization cannot possibly live up to its promises. Maurizio Lazzarato, that's a cool name, Maurizio Lazzarato, has provided an insightful analysis of this dark side of neoliberal subjectivity. He argues that the entrepreneurial subject is essentially a means to shift the costs and risks of a flexible and financialized economy towards the individual. Yeah, though this is the gig economy. To make an entrepreneur enterprise of oneself means not just investing in one's future earnings, but also taking responsibility for poverty, unemployment, precariousness, welfare benefits, low wages, reduced pensions, etc., as if these were the individual's resources and investments to manage his capital as his capital. In times of constant economic crisis, now, Lazzarato argues the universality of entrepreneurial man has given way to the universality of indebted man. That's now. Paradoxically, then, the promise of liberating the subject by treating her as the owner of her own person and capacities for which she owes nothing to society, to use the famous phrase from Macpherson, ends up reiterating and institutionalizing the very dependency it claims to overcome. If you owe nothing to society, then society owes nothing to you. If society owes you nothing, you have to pay for all of its services. If you cannot afford them, debt is the only way out. Thus, the neoliberal attempt to make everyone free by making everyone an entrepreneur ends up transforming everyone into a debtor, either literally, for example in ISAs, or metaphorically, for example in workfare policies, where the individual seems to owe her labor force to society at large. This tension between ownership and entrepreneurship and debt, however, is not the end of neoliberal rationality. Quite the opposite. It is the governmental technique most adequate to the production of the entrepreneurial self. With this technique, neoliberalism not only substitutes social rights such as education, healthcare, retirement, and unemployment insurance for a mere right to contract debt, but also reduces economic and political uncertainty by making people more predictable and controllable. We see clearly that neoliberalism is not just a matter of markets growing wild, but is just as much a governmental technique of securing states of economic actors, which is another crucial pillar of its pervasiveness. And as in the case of Locke and his theistic appeals, these governmental techniques don't operate by limiting individual freedom from without, but by restructuring it from within. Neoliberal rationality governs not against, but through freedom, or at least the fiction of freedom. Entering debt contracts is a voluntary activity, and so is to a degree repaying them. If I produce no income, I don't have to pay back my ISAs. If I choose not to work under workfare policies, no one literally can force me into it. But making use of this freedom in a thoroughly economized society devoid of social rights amounts to little more than pushing oneself into poverty and socio-political isolation, that is, into social death. The pervasive effect of neoliberal rationality is not that it literally forces subjects to labor, in contrast to Locke's workhouses, but that it restructures freedom in such a way that it can only be pursued by competition and capitalism. Okay. Conclusion, you are not alone. Yeah, this is sort of a very apt paper for nowadays. I know people repaying their loans for many years, and they would get better jobs, they would do different things if they were not so burdened, but because everything was so expensive and they just had to take out a loan. I mean, who has money? I'm sure somebody does, but I don't know them. In the beginning of this article, I emphasized the pervasive effects that help to stabilize neoliberal projects but are left unexplained by Marxist approaches such as Harvey's. While adopting a broadly Foucauldian perspective on I don't know how to say Foucauldian. Like, I know how to say Foucault, but is this Foucauldian? Foucauldian perspective on neoliberalism, I highlighted a category that Foucault tends or chooses to overlook: property, or more specifically, the role of property in neoliberal rationality and subjectivity. Doing so allowed me to develop, as it were, a non-economistic perspective on the interplay of economic and subjective categories, focusing on the notion of self-ownership. Self-ownership, from its very origin, in the Leveler's discourse onwards, a discursive tool forged by socio-political conflicts. As such, it always entails a certain vision of society. Originally aiming at emancipatory and democratic ends, it underwent its first subversion in the work of John Locke, who, by treating God as the ultimate owner, naturalized private property and established a universal obligation to labor. In the hands of Locke, then, self-ownership is about more than negative liberty. It inscribes a certain rationality, the rationality of landed property, onto the subject. Just like landed property in the person shouldn't lie to waste. As we have seen, Locke is not shy of backing up the implementation of this rationality by disciplinary apparatuses. In neoliberalism, we have found a second, much more radical subversion of self-ownership. Just like Locke, neoliberals emphasize strong private property rights, but they naturalize them by appealing to the market's efficiency instead of God. From freedom in neoliberal theory is conditional on strong property rights and free markets. The latter is spelled out in terms of unhampered entrepreneurial activity. In human and capital theory, this entrepreneurial activity is itself analyzed in possessive categories, even if only implicitly. The entrepreneurial self owns and runs itself like a firm. Its capital can be used as collateral and become the object of economic transaction and speculation. As before in the case of Locke, this inscribes a specific rationality onto the subject. Only this time it is the rationality of capital. The enforcement of this rationality becomes pervasive governmental techniques of neoliberalism, whether in ISAs, workfare policies, or elsewhere. This enforcement, however, frustrates the very promises it makes. If Locke's brilliance was found in his ability to use the levelers, egalitarian, and emancipatory categories to stabilize rather than to subvert prevailing power structures, then something very similar seems to be true for neoliberalism. Instead of treating everyone as equals, liberating them, and allowing for self-determination, the rhetoric that everyone is an entrepreneur, ! Consolidates inequalities, precariousness, and ethical impoverishment. The entrepreneurial and the indebted subjects are flip sides of the same coin. Neoliberal self-ownership is the disease that purports to cure. How is this spell to be broken? Perhaps it makes sense to remember that the notion of self-ownership, long before it was subverted and abused, once started as a call for emancipation that challenged an existing power regime in the name of a different version of society. If nothing else, we have seen how deeply this call for emancipation has shaped what was to come, even if often in surprising and contradictory ways. What would take the place of this call today? Occupy's ingenious notion, "You are not alone," might be a good point to start. Okay, fun paper. Well written. I think well argued too. You can see in the first half of the paper, doing the history and sort of this stuff here with the levelers and John Locke, and showing how the initial conception of neoliberal self-ownership then got converted by John Locke into a power of the state, then is now being sort of replayed in modern society by capitalist forces. So we've got this nice parallel in the the conceptual history and the recent history that kind of spells out the same conclusion, that you are not alone, but that what happens is in the history sort of being paralleled, you get this the author then has the ability to say, look, in going from God to natural rights, we've now gone from natural rights to rationality. And that means that the concepts that were at work that initially were emancipatory are now governing you in the way you even consider what is rational to do. So it went from the landed rights of the oligarchs to the person by saying, no, we have our own rights by owning ourselves. Then that got taken over. So yeah, you have the right to be alone all of a sudden. And so the trick, of course, was that if you make it into a rational thing, then it's getting free rent in your head. You have to think, oh, what am I doing to self-improve myself? What am I doing to repay my loan? And this is the problem that eventually is given here. So, you are not alone. I hope everyone hearing this knows that they are not alone. It seems very weird things. But yeah, I did like this bit here showing that how this sort of neoliberalism basically, for all the things it purports to do well, it really is doing the opposite quite often. So that was a nice section, I thought. Let's see, what else is going on in this paper? So we've got the parallel of the history and the contemporary stuff, conceptually and sort of historically. Then we've got the second stage from sort of like also the conceptual history, from going from like the person, the God, to nature, and then into rationality. And that is always an interesting story too. So this was a nice paper. Anyone out there have any questions? I don't know. Let me know now, or else I'll be done for now and I'll come back later tonight with another paper. Okie dokie. Have a good day. Stay safe out there, and hopefully the U.S. government, I was just going to say it would actually do something worthwhile, but I mean, I realized how stupid that was before I was going to say it. So, I hope your government does better than ours. Have a great day. Bye-bye.